Hello, everyone, and welcome to part three of my three-part series on conducting academic research. This one is covering social and hard science literature, decoding the methods from the madness, as it were. We are looking at some of these complicated studies and experiments and just trying to get a basic understanding of how to engage with it and, well, ideally, understand some of it. So let's cover the tips. These are the ones I'm going to go through in this entire video. Up front, step one, read the abstract. Step two, move on to the introduction and the conclusion to get a big picture. Step three, return to the discussion section to answer those questions and presumably the literature review or anything else you need to start digging into it. Step four, check out the methods to figure out how things were done. Step five, chase down any remaining leads. You follow these steps, you'll be in pretty good shape for at least getting a sense as to what they're trying to accomplish and how well they did it. Step one, the abstract. The great news with hard and soft sciences is there's usually an abstract, which is a paragraph right up front, or even in the library search results, that's going to describe and overview the study. That's really, really useful for you to get a big picture perspective. It's also useful to you if you're conducting your own independent research and trying to find resources to pull in for your own project, because the abstract will tell you if it's relevant or not. So the abstract tells you what they're looking into and why, and it can help you determine the relevance of the thing. If it's still relevant to you after you read the abstract and what you're trying to learn, great, now is the time to save it. If it's not relevant, but interesting, maybe you want to save it anyway, but maybe put it in a different folder or something. Don't get distracted by papers that aren't relevant to your research. You can always read them later, you can always save them. But at any rate, the abstract is your first stop. You can even see this in most search databases. You can see the abstract before you even download the article, and that can save you a lot of time. So do start with the abstract to get the big picture, if nothing else, and then determine its relevance to what you're trying to accomplish now. So here's an example. This paper is coming out of Israel. You can see that in the bibliographic information here. So even before we're looking at the abstract, we can gather some contextual information about the article. A lot of spirituality research comes out of Israel because they have a state religion. They're very religious in general, so they do a lot of research on well-being and spirituality there. So, this is going to be fairly innovative research, but it might be limited to a particular cultural context. That's a limitation we want to keep in mind. But at any rate, we can look at the abstract here and figure out pretty quickly what they're doing here. Maybe you just want to jump right ahead down to the conclusion even, but up here we can see very quickly the objectives of the study, right? They are trying to look at an association between spirituality and subjective well-being, abbreviated as SWB, which is important information for us because we're going to see more of that later on here, particularly in the context of later in life. What they are innovating by reading this, we can see that they are doing a multi-dimensional approach. They are trying to connect different kinds of spirituality to two different measures of subjective well-being later in life, one being depression, one being an overall measurement of satisfaction with life, right? So they've got spirituality scales that they're measuring. They're trying to measure that against depression, satisfaction with life. Those are their two main measurements of subjective well-being. And we can also see the results here right up front. Personal and communal spirituality were the most dominant domains reported by spiritual participants, followed by environmental spirituality. Transcendental spirituality was the least reported domain. Personal spirituality was the only domain positively associated with SWB. What does that mean? That means that the subjects who did this survey, the more personal spirituality the higher they scored in personal spirituality, the more, the higher satisfaction with their lives they reported and lower depression. So that's an association, that's a predictive relationship. These are technical terms that are unique to statistics and survey methodology. You're not a survey methodologist probably, but by looking at the abstract, you can kind of glean that, and we can go even further and look at the conclusion. These findings demonstrate that not all spirituality domains are equally dominant in people's lives or positively associated with subjective well-being. They also suggest that encouraging elderly people to develop their personal spirituality and self-growth may contribute to their well-being. Now, if you're doing a project on spirituality and well-being, well, hey, even this statement is useful to you, right? They also suggest that encouraging elderly people to develop their personal spirituality and self-growth may contribute to their well-being. There we go. So looking at the abstract, we've already assessed what this study is about. We have a good sense as to how they did it, what they were looking at. I may, as a statistician, take issue with the fact that they're doing a multidimensional prediction of, depression and satisfaction separately, as opposed to making some kind of composite index or whatever. But that's expertise that you may not have, and you don't really need necessarily to get something out of looking at this article. But at the very least, we can see right up front here what it's about and how relevant it is to a given project. Step 2, reading the introduction and conclusion. Now that I know I like this study enough to read it further, the first thing I'm going to do is try and get a big picture as to what they were doing, how they were measuring it. The introduction and conclusion are, much like with the previous videos, a good place to start to continue to refine that overview. So as you do this, write down the key terms, such as, what does SWB mean? Are you going to have to reference back to that? That might be a good thing to put in your notes, that means subjective well-being, and they're measuring it in two different ways, depression and satisfaction later in life. And again, write down those definitions as they come up so that you can reference back to them in your notebook or wherever else so you don't get confused. Also try to write down the hypothesis and the research questions if they are available. Many of hard and social science studies are going to have both either research questions or hypotheses or both. And you can find those somewhere in there. They may not be right in the abstract. They may be in the abstract. They may not be in the introduction. You might have to do a little bit of searching, but we'll look at them in just a second and get some tips as to how to find those. The literature review may be our next stop. If we can't find in the introduction or conclusion what the research questions are, the literature review or other background information, depending on the publication and the kind of study, people may put those things tucked away somewhere else, but you're going to want to find those. That could be kind of the objective of reading the introduction and conclusion and these other early assessments of the study itself. If the introduction is brief and doesn't clear anything up for you, like I said, you may end up digging a little bit deeper in the background or literature review. Write down your questions, not just their questions and their hypotheses. What do you want to have resolved from reading this paper? You should have a clear picture of that as you go forward as well. You'll look for the answers next. So here's our introduction. You can see this is a very short article. This is a 9-page article. And so when you have an article that short, people are working really hard to make it that short. That is a publication requirement probably of the journal, not necessarily a decision of the author. So it can be kind of tricky to make things fit into that context. We might have to lose some information. But at any rate, we can see the introduction here, and it's pretty straightforward. Interest in spirituality in later life has recently increased primarily due to empirical research demonstrating the benefits of spirituality to various aspects of well-being. Blah, 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 blah. So this is pretty short, but again, the introduction is great for giving you that overview. Oh yes, this is about spirituality later in life. That's something I'm interested in. I can go further. Also, since it is so short, we can just probably read through the whole article, but I still recommend getting a big picture before you start digging into things like the literature review or the conclusion. So if we do jump ahead to the conclusion, we see this, that their findings indicated that the 4 spirituality domains are not equally dominant in people's lives. Personal and communal spirituality are the most dominant domains reported by participants, followed by environmental spirituality, and transcendental spirituality was the least reported domain. By now, you should be thinking, I wonder what these different domains are. But now, by looking at the conclusion, you can see, okay, they're talking about spirituality later in life. They're measuring in a specific way. What way, Jonathan, are they measuring these things? Well, they're measuring 4 different spirituality domains. I sure would like to know what those are. Now I have a question to answer. I'm going to go look for those definitions, which will help build my understanding. There they are. They came from the literature review. Pretty easy to find. This is how they're defining those different measures. That may seem like a little bit of a roundabout kind of way, but it helps us figure out what information to focus on rather than just trying to dig through all of this intense research. Here's another thing coming out of the literature review. So both these definitions and the research questions were found in the literature review section here. That's not unusual. Thankfully, they're usually easy to find. It's not unusual to see research questions listed, question 1, question 2, question 3, and we can see what they're doing. And then you could organize your notes around those questions as well. 3, discussion section. This is arguably the most interesting part if you know what the paper is talking about already, so adjust your plan accordingly. If you don't know what the paper is talking about, then you should figure that out before you get to the discussion section and read through it. If you do know what the paper is about already, then maybe you want to start here. That's fine too. Anyway, here's the discussion section. We can see an interesting observation. Overall, the findings pointed at a complex phenomenon, according to which both personal and communal spirituality were the most dominant domains reported by participants, but showed opposite associations with SWB. So that's interesting. We don't know exactly what that means yet, and maybe you won't have the expertise, but you can see they're stating what they think is interesting here. This is just an example of one thing that pops up in the discussion. Hopefully now by looking at the other parts, we have some context by which to assess this. However, you may be sensing that we might have to dig a little deeper to understand some of the methodology that's leading to this thing. And what does this mean when they say that they showed opposite associations with subjective well-being? Well, we might have to start digging into the methods to understand what that means. The methods, this will make the most sense when you know what they're trying to do and why. Now we know that they're trying to measure spirituality of 4 domains. We see some different results across those domains. Now we might be in a better position to kind of assess what they actually did, and that'll help our understanding as well. If you know what they're trying to do, the methods can help you better understand how people answer those kinds of questions. And also, you're not going to be able to effectively criticize any article whose methods you do not understand. Just keep that in mind. You're not always going to be required to do that, but if you don't understand the methods, you're not going to be able to mount an appropriate criticism of that particular paper. So what can we learn from the methods? Well, there are a couple different things they're looking at here, so we'll keep this discussion fairly limited. They are trying to answer several different research questions, and we can look into those. Here is table 6. So scrolling through those 9 pages, you'll see a lot of other tables in there. The tables are showing the results of their statistical analysis. Now here is the one that I am most interested in, because this is the table that is looking at their major independent and dependent variables. Independent variables here that they were looking at were these measures right here of spirituality, and these are the dependent variables. What does that mean? Well, that means that they're using the variables on the left here to predict mathematically these things. That's what the analysis is trying to do, and it gives you an indication of, say, okay, if the participant expresses more personal spirituality, that seems to have a negative and statistically significant, that's important too, mathematically speaking, a statistically significant relationship with depression. More personal spirituality, less depression. How much less? Well, that's what this beta coefficient is showing you. Again, if you don't have the expertise to investigate that, don't worry too much about it. All you really need to know is it is a rate of association between these two variables ranging from 0 to 1, and that can give you a rough estimate as to, well, that's a pretty good association, pretty strong association. It ain't a 1-to-1, but there's something happening here. Those are the kinds of information we can get out of tables like this if we have a basic understanding of the methods. But we can also see that more personal satisfaction was also statistically associated with more personal life satisfaction. Okay, so then we're getting more sense of that previous claim in the conclusion or the discussion where they said, these things are not related in the they're inversely related, which makes sense. You would think that less depression would be associated with more satisfaction in your life. So not as confusing as it sounds. But we can also, if we want to spend some time investigating the methods and their results, we can learn some other interesting things in here as well. We can look at, you can see some other variables that they're controlling for here, and they're seeing how they associate with these factors. And so 0.28 is pretty high, and some of the other highest ones are 0.256, also statistically significant, and 0.226. I'm trying not to get too far into the weeds here, but that's kind of interesting. What are those two things? Predicting satisfaction of life positively? Oh, self-rated health and income. Wow, who would have guessed? So, yes, personal spirituality matters, and reducing depression and increasing life satisfaction later in life, but other things that help are self-rated health and income. That's pretty telling as well, not unexpected But it's interesting to have that comparison. Now, again, you're not statisticians necessarily, but you don't have to be as long as you have a basic understanding of some of these things. This is kind of one of the later, that's why I put this in the later steps, right? If you understand what they're looking for and why, then you can start understanding what this is. You can look up what a beta coefficient is and how to read a table like this. But even without that level of understanding, you should be able to get something out of the article, even if you don't dig into the methods section. Now, the last step I put on here is to chase down leads. Anything that falls into the category of scholarly will have references, and those are a good place to look for leads, as well as in the introduction and background and the literature review, because if any scholar worth their salt is going to be revisiting things that have already been done on this topic. So by looking at what they are looking at, then that might give you an indication of like, wow, I really don't understand what's going on all that well. I might need a little bit more background on this topic. I want to learn more about personal spirituality. Do they have a reference for that? The methods will help with this too, if you understand them enough. But usually new ideas and references are not to be found in the conclusion. So keep that in mind. The implications for the big picture are, however, so that's why I recommend reading that early so that you can kind of get that big picture and then dial in the resolution on the paper. So who are they referencing? Is there a particular study that they keep mentioning? That might be a clue that it is a seminal study, and what we mean by that is that it is foundational. It is something strongly influencing subsequent works in the field, and that might be a good thing for you to go check out too. Thus, step 8 is to chase down the leads. They could also just be referencing someone whose results they are trying to replicate an awful lot. That's fine too. Whatever it is, it should be useful to chase down those leads and further developing your own research and your understanding of the material. So that's kind of a quick and dirty way of dealing with this. And I know it may seem a little confusing to kind of bounce around like that, but the central philosophy is the same as what we've discussed with the previous 2 videos. You are trying to get a big picture of the thing. You may never have to do much more than read through the abstract to understand what's happening there. But the further you're able to dig in, the more you will learn. This technique is designed, I am providing this technique for you to help you do that. You can take a step back, you can look at the paper at an appropriate distance, see what they're doing, try to engage with it critically on that level, and then you can dig down deeper and you can excavate the different pieces of information that they have, the methods, and everything else in between. So I hope that this helps you wrangle with the field of hard and soft sciences and academic research in general. If you have any questions, let me know, and take care. Good luck.